Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are back for my LEC Winter Split Week number 3 overview, analysis, and power rankings video. Very excited to get into it. Of course, again, a lot to cover, 15 games, but it is the final week of the regular season, and as we've come to expect here in the LEC, 2 of the teams in the LEC will be eliminated this week. They will not be making the best of 3 stage, the playoff stage, if you really want to call it that. I kind of consider playoffs starting at the best of 5s, the top 4, but if you want to start it with the best of 3s, I think that that's totally fair, especially because there are teams getting eliminated here. If you want to know my thoughts on week 1 and week 2, you can check out the playlist up in the iCard that has my preseason analysis, as well as my thoughts on week 1 and week 2 going into this. My power rankings for that are up there. You don't need to watch that in order to understand where my thoughts and opinions are. We'll be talking about a lot of that in today's video, but it's certainly good viewing. I would hope that, the videos are entertaining, but I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning of this. Let's go ahead and get right into the analysis. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover. And of course, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week at the end of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be updating my power rankings at the end of this from number 1 to number 10, but for the most part, we're going to be talking about the bracket a lot more than we're going to be talking about the power rankings. It's pretty irrelevant if you are the 6th or the 7th best team in the league right now if you can't go up against the team that you're facing in a best of 3 and take them down. Of course, it is a double elimination bracket, so the power rankings are going to give some, context towards who I think will be moving on to, top 6 and then eventually top 4. But for now, it's really just going to be about the main matchups in round number 1 as we get through week number 3. So without further ado, let's get into it. We're going to, of course, start with day number 1. That's how it starts here in week number 3. And our first matchup was a pretty predictable one as we saw SK Gaming taking on Team BDS, and BDS picking up the win here. No surprise, no shocker here. SK is going to move to 0-7. This team has just been an absolute disaster in every single possible way. At the start of 2025, everything that could go wrong for this team has gone wrong. It honestly reminds me so much of what Corp was last year, not just because I think the solo laners compare very unfavorably to players like Cabochard and Seiken from last year, but I think mostly because this team just completely lacks an identity. They don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. They have some talent on this team. It's not completely devoid of an idea. I think they play kind of similarly to how Corp played last year, but they do not know how to play the mid or late game at all. They just have no concept of how to play out a winning game from even a neutral state. If they're not winning by a ridiculous amount of gold, I just don't really see an avenue for them to be able to win any games. I think their early games are generally fine, or at least most of their early games are generally fine, but it's actually being able to close out a game that I think is going to be a major struggle for SK. For BDS on the other side, this team is fine. This was a good performance, but doesn't necessarily change my ideas on BDS. I still think this team has a lot that it needs to figure out. I think they did a good job of being able to capitalize on an early game, poke-oriented comp. We're seeing that rise in popularity here in the LEC. I'm not necessarily sure if it's the direction I would be going in, but BDS certainly piloted it well. Nuke is going to get player of the game for the Jace performance. We've seen a couple of really good Jace performances in the LEC recently, most notably Kana last week I think was really excellent on that champion and really was able to take over and make his impact felt, but Nuke this time, the one to be given kind of the keys to the Jace and really make it work. He was everywhere on the map, and he continues to show a lot of that good development that he showed last year. He's going to be really high up in player of the game standings because BDS has really relied on him as a primary option for them throughout this split so far. To me, he's playing exactly how he did in 2024, and again, that's a good thing if you followed the channel. Last year was the year that Nuke kind of cemented himself in that clearly above average, right outside the elite level of mid laners. He was right below players like Caps and Humanoid. He wasn't on that level, but he was the tier below that. He was definitely better than your average mid laner at this level. And again, I think he's carried that over. He's able to play a little bit of everything, and while Reeker didn't put up really any sort of opposition, any sort of real contention on the other side of this, I still think you got to give credit to Nuke, who has been BDS's best player by far at the start of this year. I think the bot lane also played really well here. Ice and Paris were very solid. Paris is starting to find his footing, I would say, in the LEC. It definitely took him some time. Ice was not very good last week, and so it's nice to see this bot lane get back on track. Loopy has been a disaster for SK, and so it's not shocking shocking to see support be a little bit of a gap in favor of BDS, but it is good to see. 113 was excellent here, mega gapped Isma on the other side. Again, when you're playing things like Nidalee Jace, you need to be super active and super aggressive in the early game. I think 113 was able to show off why he was so successful last year in the LFL in a game like this, where you can see how adept he is at generating early leads. He is a very good team fighter if he can get there. The consistency has not been there at all so far to start this split. The rookies in general, I think across the entire league, have not really looked all that good so far to start the LEC year, but this is good to see 113 in Paris, to a lesser extent, kind of moving in a positive direction, starting to move upwards in terms of their trajectory. Irrelevant was fine, wasn't particularly good in the laning phase, but was really good outside of it. BDS is BDS, right? Like, this team runs through Nuke at the current moment. It feels like he is going to be the primary option, and specifically, if 113 is going to be able to win his jungle matchups, they're going to be able to beat a lot of teams in the league. But SK, like I said, is just a disaster. They're losing in basically every possible way. I think if you're looking for things to caveat, like Rahel and Loopy weren't awful in this one. Rahel has generally been fine this year. It feels like he is mega hard stuck. Loopy didn't lose quite as hard as he has been. Like, he's been one of the 3 players on this team that I've pointed to over and over again, saying that he's actively losing them games, the solo laners and Loopy. The solo laners were not good, but GIANTX won lane, as he tends to do, and then just does absolutely nothing with that in the mid to late game. Very frustrating to watch, and Reeker is just not good enough for this level. There's really nothing else to say there. But unfortunately, that means dud of the game is going to go to Isma in the jungle. I've seen a lot of takes about Isma online, not only from this game, but coming out of this week, where it's like, why does Isma have a job in the LEC? He has not really been the primary issue on SK. In fact, I would argue that he's maybe been the best performing player on SK across this split. He's had a couple of really good early games. He just can't really translate them into anything else. He's a very limited player, very one-dimensional, but one dimension is more than most of this team has, right? Like, Loopy, Reeker, and GIANTX, they don't even really have a dimension. Isma at least can, get some advantages and have some good pathing early and be able to create something there. He just doesn't really know what he's supposed to do with it, but in this one, he just completely ran it down. Like, he was genuinely inting by the end of this game. There were times where the Xinjiao was, like, legitimately just walking into the enemy team. I don't even really know what to say at that point. Hopefully, he ends up playing better. Again, this is a guy who, when he has to play from a deficit, looks absolutely miserable, but when he gets to play somewhat comfortably from an advantage, like, he's been okay on things like the Nidalee earlier on in this split. Him and Rahel have been the only 2 players that I think have been even remotely defendable for SK. This was just not a defendable performance from Isma, but SK sucks. Like, there's nothing else to say. They're 0-7. They're basically guaranteed to be bottom 2. At this point, they're just playing to get 1 win. They're just, like, praying that they're able to get on the board, really, at any point, and so we'll see if they can do that later on in the week, but this is a nice win for BDS. Hopefully, they can carry some of this momentum into the last half of the regular season so that they're not quite going into that best of 3 stage with as low of confidence as they probably had coming out of week 2. Then moving on to game number 2 here of day 1, and again, kind of a short game, kind of a blowout, but this one much less expected. It was GIANTX taking on Fnatic, and Fnatic is going to pick up yet another dominant victory. This team moves to 6-1, and they have just been clicking on every single level so far in 2025. It feels like this is the best version of Fnatic that we have seen in quite a long time, and I'm definitely going to say that. And one thing I definitely will say is that I haven't really had a lot of faith in Fnatic to win the LEC in recent splits. In recent years, it always felt like they were good in the regular seasons, but I didn't know how it would translate. This is the best I've felt about a potential Fnatic LEC championship run in a very long time, and we'll get to why as we discuss this. For GIANTX, it's unfortunate that it feels like the crazy momentum you generated at the start of the split wasn't quite sustainable, but this is still like a top 5, top 6 team in the LEC at the current moment. And that's probably good enough for what the expectations were. You still are getting good performances out of the players that need to show up. It's just not quite as ubiquitous across the board. You don't quite have this like dominant team from top to bottom as maybe like Fnatic does on the other side of this. You still have a lot of promise, but we're definitely starting to see more of the gaps, I would say, in GX as we go further and further along. But again, we'll get to that later on. Let's talk about Fnatic first and foremost. Player of the game was very difficult because 3 players played out of their minds in this one. Razork and Upset were really the 2 that I was deciding between. Both of them were absolutely phenomenal. Razork is just an absolute menace on Maokai. It's one of his best champions, and it's certainly been one of the most consistent for Fnatic over the past year or so, but I pretty much have to give it to Upset. I know that Razork maybe made a bigger impact on the game as a whole, but not only narratively, but just like in terms of what Fnatic is doing, Upset's ability to be able to dominate these games and take over with the resources that he's getting, like that's the reason Fnatic feels so different. Their macro has been phenomenal. Mickey X has come in and really changed, I think, how this team wants to play. They seem to have a very good idea of how to play this new map and how to be aggressive and generate their own leads so that when they do get to these objective skirmishes around things like Otacon, they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and Upset being such a consistent carry is a big reason for that. Again, we haven't seen Upset play like this since he left Fnatic, like, what, 3 years ago now? Him coming back to this organization, getting into a bot lane with someone like Mickey, who is clearly, like, very comfortable in this new meta, it's just all working. And so that, for me, gets Upset player of the game, not to mention the fact that he's just been so aggressive. One of the things I criticized Upset for the most over the past couple of years has been his lack of ability to take the game into his own hands, right? That Patrick mentality, that Teddy mentality, as I like to frequently call it, where he kind of just wants to be the guy that gets funneled and then hopefully can take over the game later on, like use his really good team fighting to be able to win, but it's not necessarily like a controllable style. It means really good teams are just going to get too big of a lead against you and you're not going to be able to come back in that regard. It really does feel like Upset has been unleashed on the league right now, using his mechanical skill and using, quite frankly, his mechanical gap on a lot of the rest of the AD carries to just punish them in the mid game. It's really, really good to see. Now, part of that is him getting facilitated, right? Like, is Razork and Mickey looking really good, but you just have to give a lot of credit to Fnatic. They know exactly how to play around their star ADC, and he's playing better than he has in a very long time. But again, Razork, Mickey, major shoutouts to them. Oscar and Humanoid, I think, were fine as well. Huma, in particular, looked really good in the back half of this game on the Corki, but this was Razork, Upset, and Mickey X as the stars for Fnatic, as they have kind of been throughout a majority of the start of this split. And then for GIANTX on the other side, they're just a very limited team in terms of playing against, like, actually good macro teams. They have very good hands. Jackie's, Noah, Jun, even, like, Closer and Lot. Like, these players are talented enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with middle-table teams in the LEC and just kind of be able to out-tempo them in the early game. Fnatic's a different beast, especially when they are going to be playing around a super carry in the Kai'Sa in the bot lane, a hyper carry, if you will. Jackie's and Noah, you know, Jun, I think they did their jobs, but unfortunately, the lane swap does not work out for GIANTX, and top lane just gets absolutely abused throughout this game. Lot is going to get dud of the game. So much pressure put onto the top side, so much pressure put into making this Jace's life an absolute hell, and Lot just could not quite survive. I'm not even going to blame him entirely. He's been pretty good at the start of this split. He's certainly been like an upper half top laner, which I think is a really encouraging sight in the first split, but this is kind of what happens when rookies get a lot of attention and a lot of resources put into shutting them down and taking them out of their comfort zone, as they just kind of fold and crumble under the pressure, and that's unfortunately what happened to Lot. Jackie's was also way too over-aggressive in the back half here on the Aurora. We've seen a couple of times where it's like, the Aurora can go in, trade 1-for-1, and you kind of live with that. Jackie's, unfortunately, wasn't able to blow up Humanoid in one of these final fights, and it just led to situations where the Aurora didn't feel quite as useful as she could. But, you know, unfortunately for Noah and Jun, they couldn't quite win the revenge game. I'm sure they had a lot of the anticipation on their mind. They certainly circled this one on the calendar, but they're going to have to wait at least a little bit longer to get another rematch with Fnatic, because they are just clicking on every cylinder right now. Again, this is the best version of Fnatic that we have seen in quite a long time, in my opinion, in many, many years. My hope for them is that they can keep this up. I know that obviously there are a lot of other teams that are going to be gunning for that top 1 spot, but there was a reason I put Fnatic at number 1 last week, because it just feels like they are the total package right now. Then moving on to game 3 of day number 1, and golly, what a crash out from this team. It's Rogue taking on G2. And G2 is going to pick up the win, like they are going to win this, but not thanks to their own efforts. This team continues to really concern me in terms of the way that they look on the Rift. They were 500 coming into this, and they just played one of the worst teams in the entire league, gave over a gigantic lead in the early game, and then won because that team had no idea what they were doing, like genuinely because it was like a 2v8. Genuinely insane stuff, not only from G2, but from Rogue. How is it even humanly possible for you to lose the game in the position that you were in? You would have to have, oh, I don't know, a mid and an AD carry that are doing absolutely nothing in any of these fights, which is exactly what Rogue had. It is just disgraceful to see how this team plays, and it's not like G2 played significantly better. This was just kind of a bad game all around, in my opinion, and that means it's getting the rare distinction of being the first game, and maybe one of the last in 2025. I only did this once last year, where a player on the losing team is going to get player of the game. It's not going to be a player on G2 G2, Adam is getting player of the game in the top lane for Rogue, because you know what? Adam was freaking awesome in this game on the Jace. We're continuing to see that champion really be like an important piece for either winning or losing games in the LEC, either because it gets targeted down and ends up not really being relevant like it was for Lot, or because it's dominant, like it was for, you know, Nuke in game number 1. Adam was excellent here on the Jace. He was able to get a pretty gigantic early lead on Broken Blade, who's really not been all that good at the start of 2025. I imagine that he will get better, but he's been fine, like average level in terms of top lane right now in the LEC. Not great. Adam definitely was a lot stronger in this game, and you know what? He was trying his best to win some of these fights 1v9 in the later half of the game, but there's only so much that a Jace can do to be able to try and fight around Otacon when everybody else on your team is completely and utterly trolling. I feel so bad for Adam, but he is going to get player of the game for me. And you know what? Let's just start with Rogue. I know they lost the game, but let's talk about them first because I think they are the more interesting thing to talk about here. Adam played well. I think Malrang did enough in this game. Maybe you would have liked to see him be a bit more aggressive in some of these later fights. I do think he played that Otacon fight really poorly, but at the end of the day, like, he was far from the problem on this team. You have no mid laner and you have no AD carry. Like, Rogue genuinely have the worst player in those two roles in the entire league. Maybe not mid lane, because Reeker has been pretty awful, but Patrick going 0-3-0 in a game where you have a top laner that's completely running things, where, you know, things are breaking open, not participating in a single kill across the entire game. How is that even possible? Like, Patrick has been not even just the worst, like, LEC player this year, because I do think he's been worse than players like Reeker on SK, even though he is on a team that is theoretically doing better. I think that, you know, Rogue has more talent right now. Their best player is better than SK's best player. Adam is just really that good, but not only is he been that bad, this is one of the worst LEC performances I've ever seen through 7 games. It's genuinely absurd to see him playing the way that he is. Like, he shouldn't even be anywhere near the LEC if he's going to be playing like this, but he's not even done of the game. For me, it's kind of gotta go to Larson, because his was even more egregious. Not only was Patrick playing super safe and not really involving himself in anything, but he wasn't making gigantic mistakes. You're playing Galio as Larson, and you're playing scared and safe and sitting behind a wall, and you've got that famous clip of him sitting in the pit and just throwing out a Q and not doing anything else in this gigantic 5v5 that ends up determining what happens for the rest of the game. I don't know what to say. Like, Larson has been awful at this point. His, like, passive, scared mentality, it's gotten even worse from what it was last year. It's certainly gotten worse from what it was in his prime. This team just has no agency. They have no aggressiveness, and Larson and Patrick are the reason for that. Execute has not been very good in the support position, but he's also playing with by far the worst AD carry in the entire league, so how much of that is his fault? I don't know. Adam was so good, though, and the fact that he lost this game is genuinely absurd, because he was by far, in my opinion, the single best player on the Rift. And then for G2 on the other side, you're going to be thanking your lucky stars you were able to walk out of this with a win. I'm not going to try and sit here and say that they were awful. I think they played some of these later fights well, and they were able to get this gigantic win at Otacon that ended up really sealing the game for them. I think Caps was a big reason for that. I think Hansama had a good game. Labrav, Broken Blade were fine. Skumon wasn't like a huge problem. The issue is that this team just has no early game to speak of. This is the problem that they had last year, except it's expedited and expounded by like 100 times. There's just not really a lot going on in the early game for this team. They are much more macro focused and they are much more team fight focused, which is just not the map. It's not the current meta. They need to be able to start winning these skirmishes, or at least be more aggressive in the early game. I think the avenue towards that is playing towards Hansama on the bottom side of the map, allowing Broken Blade to play these tanks and trying to get, you know, Hans on something that can be a little bit more aggro in the 2v2. I think that was the idea behind picking the Ezreal here and, you know, the Leona and things like that, but you still weren't in a good spot. Adam was winning the game for Rogue on the top side, and you were going into 10-15 minutes into the game without really a lot of avenues to be able to get yourself back into it. If Rogue had even had a functioning mid and bot lane, they would have won this game super easily. Like, I'm just not impressed with G2. Skumon continues to look pretty bad, in my opinion, is one of the weaker junglers in the league in terms of the performances he's put out. Hansama has been fine, but kind of a non-factor. I think Caps is trying his best and was really good in this game. I'm acting as if they lost, but Caps was really good in the back half of this. Hans was really good in the back half of this. I think Labrav is finding his footing, but there is just something off about this G2 team that's kind of keeping them out of that top 2, top 3 discourse for me right now. They have not played like a team that deserves to be considered on the same level as like a Fnatic or even like a K-Corp or a KOI or anything like that, right? It's just not really working out for them. I need to see more later in the week, even with this win. And for Rogue, it's just worst case scenario. This team is genuinely awful. Like, there's nothing else to say. They have an awful off on on day number 2 against SK. That's going to be the most entertaining part of day number 2, just to see what ends up happening. I think that will determine who the weakest player in the LEC is, and right now, Patrick and Larson are making strong cases that it should be them. Then moving on to game number 4 here of day number 1, and a bit of an upset, certainly one that's pretty exciting. It's Team Heretics taking on Movistar KOI, and Heretics is going to pick up the win in a 38-minute game. Really good performance here from Heretics. KOI obviously had their own set of problems. I think they end up, kind of showing the flaws and the weaknesses in these poke comps that have been so popular so far in the LEC, where, yes, you are able to generate pretty decent early leads, but if the game goes long enough, if you are able to stall until 35, 40 minutes into the game, you are going to find some difficulty in being able to actually close things out in these gigantic 5v5s, and that's kind of what happened to KOI here. I'm not going to freak out too much. I think if they had slightly better execution, they probably just win this game outright, and we'll get to that, but Heretics did play well. They knew their win condition, and there were a couple of players on this team that I think definitely deserved a major shout out. None more so, in my opinion, than Sheo, who's going to get my player of the game on the Lilia. He's been pretty solid, I would say, at the start of this split. Heretics in general has looked super interesting, and they're very easy to quantify, where their rookie solo laners are definitely still learning the ropes. Like, Carlson's been near the bottom in terms of top lane rankings. Kamalu has lost them a ton of games over the course of this year already, and, he just is not a finished product. He's shown flashes, and definitely showed flashes in this one, where he was really good in the later team fights, but, they're not really all that consistent, and, Flacket and Stend are good, but there are a lot of good bot lanes in the LEC right now. Sheo, I think, has been one of the players to actually be really consistent and be just a positive for Heretics. He's kind of had the same exact form that he had on BDS. He's been very similar as a player, basically the same player, and that's a really good sign. Again, he was super useful down the stretch here. This was a great Lilia game. I would argue that he hard carried this, and, obviously we'll talk about some of the other players that did really well, but I think he should get a lot of the praise for this performance, and I'm going to give that to him here, but it's the other players on this team that I think really elevated Heretics. If it was just the Lilia performing well, I don't think you necessarily have this same kind of impact on the game, but Flacket and Stend were excellent in the bot lane. Flacket ends up getting the broadcast player of the game. The Draven was definitely flashy, and he definitely followed up well on what the Lilia and the Rel in particular were creating, but I don't think he necessarily was as relevant to the game as Sheo was, and so for me, not quite player of the game level, but definitely in the conversation. And I want to give a huge shout out to Stend, who was really good in this game. I know the scoreline doesn't necessarily look all that, sexy or all that flashy or anything like that, but his engages on the Rel, like, he was an absolute psychopath in this game. This was very, like, Hillisang, Mickey X, like, level, in terms of what he was able to put out there. I was very vocal about how I really liked how Stend played for Vitality B, and I thought he was going to be a really good addition to this Heretics team. I thought bot lane was going to be the lane that they ended up playing through, and while that has exactly been the case, that has definitely really been where a lot of their wins have come from. I think Stend has been, maybe even a little bit better than what I could have expected from day number 1. He's actually a good support. Not a great one, but like an average to slightly below average one. Like, he is certainly serviceable at this level and playing with a good AD carry. I think this bot lane is fine, and certainly one you can, count on to move forward in a positive direction. Kamalu, I think, showed a lot of interesting flashes down the stretch. This guy is just not a finished product. Like I said, he has a lot of parts of his game that just aren't good enough for the LEC level yet, and when he loses unbelievably hard. It's not perfect. It's not what Jackie's was coming out last year. He just has a lot he still needs to work on, but going up against someone like Jojo Pune and being more useful than him in the back half of the game, regardless of whether or not that was set up by the rest of your team, it's still a really good look and a really good sign. Carlson was there as well. I'm not gonna, praise him too much. He really didn't do all that much in this game in comparison to everybody else, but it's nice to see that Heretics can be this feisty team at 3 and 4 that can compete. I thought they were going to be the worst team in the LEC. That is very, very far from the case at the current moment. And then for KOI on the other side, this team has some weaknesses. Like, they're not perfect. 5-1 is a great record, and obviously they've kind of been on fire as of late. I still think this bot lane performs really well, and their early games have continued to be really solid. Mirwin has had a great start to the year, but they are flippy, and as we kind of saw with this draft, if you pick a poke comp, if you pick something that's kind of centered around playing Nidalee and Jace, and you aren't able to really close out the game or generate this gigantic lead, you are just going to get outscaled. I would put a lot more of this on the draft than I would on the individual players, but NAJ Jace has definitely made his way over the pond. Jojo Pune is going to get done of the game. You know, he does this sometimes. He's not a perfect player. He's certainly not the most consistent player in the entire world. Any North American fan will tell you that. Just go watch any of the games on Cloud9 last year, but even going back to the Evil Geniuses days, like, he was a hard carry, but he would make some absolutely baffling decisions in certain games. Like, it just feels like there are mental gaps in his, you know, ability to, you know, focus. I don't really know what else to say, and he had a couple of those down the stretch where you just kind of gotta hope he weeds it out, right? You just gotta hope that things get a little bit better for him. I think they will. I still think in major moments he's going to be able to show up, but these are the kinds of regular season performances that you just have to anticipate with Jojo Pune. There was a reason he was available at all to come over from North America, and this is kind of it. El Yoyo was also entirely useless down the stretch here on Nidalee. He did a great job of getting an early lead, and then the Lilia completely took over from the mid-game onward. That has more to do with the champion than it does with the player, but at the end of the day, like, again, I think KOI kind of lost this the moment they weren't able to close it out. I'm not going to blame them too much for this loss. I think in a different circumstance, in a best of 3, things probably look a lot different than this, but best of 1s, you can draft a comp like this, not close out the game and, you know, end up losing it. And for Heretics, at least they were able to capitalize when they were given the opportunity to be able to take a game off of KOI. You know, they're not going to get a lot of chances like this, and I think they did everything in their power to kind of come out on top, even with KOI being fine in the early game. And I think generally speaking, Sheo looked excellent. Stend looked really good. I think Flacket has been really solid. Kamalu, I think, is showing signs of progress. Heretics is a super intriguing team, not one that I think will, like, be good this year or be, like, top 6 worthy, but certainly a team that I think has upside. But then moving on to our 5th game of day number 1, our closing game of the first day, and it was a good one. Team Vitality taking on K-Corp, and K-Corp is going to pick up yet another victory. It was a little bit of a longer game, but what we are seeing is that this team is just super good across the board. I've praised basically everybody on this team across this year so far, and what I said going into, like, the end of last week was that K-Corp, honestly, in terms of form, might even be the best team in the LEC right now. Their schedule has been a little bit easier. They are a little bit backloaded in terms of a lot of their hard games, which we will see later on in the week, but they've done a really good job with a lot of the teams that they have gone up against, and if they are going to be able to keep up the form that they have shown so far, it's going to be a really, really interesting conversation to see who should be the favorite to come out of the playoffs, to come out of these best of 3s, because them and Fnatic, I think, are both just looking so dominant across these best of 1s, and so consistent, basically, across the board from number 1 to number 5 in their roles. And then for Vitality on the other side, this is an okay team. I think they had some good performances here. We will talk about it, but they just don't have the talent to keep up with K-Corp. They are in a very similar position to a team like Heretics that we just talked about, where they have a lot of promise, they have a lot of upside, but the consistency is very much not locked in just yet. But let's go ahead and talk about player of the game. That, to me, is going to Kana on the top side, although I think you could give this to one of 2 players. It should go to one of the solo laners on K-Corp. It should either go to Kana on the Ambessa or Vladi on the Corki. I think both were excellent in this one, and both have been excellent across this year so far. Kana has really re-emerged. I think we were all expecting him to come in and be really great last year. You know, I think that there were some, let's just say, trepidation from me, because Kana wasn't exactly coming off of the most dominant performances we had ever seen from him individually as a player. You know, there were definitely some question marks about what he was going to offer to K-Corp, and honestly, in year 1, or at least in that first split, that small amount of time that he was on K-Corp, the team was performing well. He was just kind of along for the ride. He was an average top laner. His laning was fine, but his team fighting was inconsistent, and there were just a lot of issues. I think he's coming out here in 2025 and showing that he has gotten acclimated a lot more to playing in Europe, to playing in the LEC, and he is really popping off. He has been one of the best top laners in the entire league, if not the best top laner in the entire league in terms of the production that he's putting out. He is actively just winning games for his team in team fights. Like, this is the Kana that I think you could have hoped for if you were K-Corp. Like, this was best case scenario in terms of the player that you were getting when you were importing him, and honestly, hopefully he can keep this up. I think he will be able to. Kana obviously has a really great track record at the LCK level. A lot of imports have a pretty good track record here in the LEC, and so I would imagine that Kana is going to continue to do well, but he abused this Jace on the other side of this matchup. Again, another game where Jace kind of determines the outcome of it, which we will get to when we get to Vitality, but Vladi has really been going under the radar for just how good he has been. You know, I said this last week, but it's crazy how little I've brought up Vladi's name, considering how well he's been playing. He has just kind of been winning lane and doing really well in team fights and being a really big positive to this team overall, but because he's not had the eye-catching moments with players like Kana or Yike or Kalist, he's not getting nearly as much mention from me. He is like the pinnacle of consistency at this point. He has really been excellent in the mid lane, and honestly, I very much considered giving him player of the game in this one over Kana because he was that good down the stretch. GIANTX was really making some mistakes in the team fighting stage on this Victor. Vladdy was not. He doesn't really make mistakes. He doesn't really like blow games wide open in the same kind of way that you're going to get out of like a superstar player, but this is the dream for a team that already has a ton of number one options, that has an AD carry that can carry in the way that they do, that has a top laner that can carry, that has a jungler that can carry, is having a mid laner that is totally fine being the second or third option, not receiving a ton of resources, and is probably going to be the best in that role in the entire league. It's genuinely insane to see what Vladdy has been able to do. Kaliste and Targamas continue to have good chemistry. Kaliste was really excellent down the stretch on the Kalista, and then Yike was really good as well, I would say, on the Sejuani. Maybe not quite that game-breaking performance that we have seen from him in other matchups so far this year, but still really solid. K-Corp is just really, really good across the board, and Vitality just didn't really have like the firepower to be able to stand up to K-Corp. This is what we see out of Vitality when they lose, or what we can expect to see. Like, this team's not going to lose gracefully. It's not necessarily the personnel that they have on roster. First of all, big shout out to Linsauce. He was by far the best player on Vitality in this game on the Wukong. I think Wukong is pretty underutilized in pro at the current moment. Let's see. Well, I guess we'll see if we see more of him throughout the week and just throughout the other regions, but outside of that, many problems, I would say, with the rest of this team. Nako is going to get dead of the game because he kind of has to on the Jace. Again, just one of those performances where you either pop off and destroy on the Jace or you get destroyed. You know, Jace, I think, has either gotten player of the game or dead of the game in almost every single game so far this week. It's pretty insane to see how warping that champion is, but Nako just got obliterated by Kana. This was the more negative side of this performance. He didn't look particularly comfortable, but Nako's been really interesting so far. Even if the results haven't been there, I think the flashes have been there enough to be intriguing. The bot lane is not going to get nearly enough credit for how awful they were here. Hylissang in particular was like awful in this game and very much deserved dead of the game. It's just Nako like needed to get it in this one in terms of how things ended up going, but Hylissang was pretty awful. Carzzy was kind of inting down the stretch. This is kind of the bot lane performance I expected to see more out of Carzzy and Hylissang when going up against actual good teams. Carzzy's KDA has been pretty solid. I think he's been fine, like a middle of the pack AD carry, but this was not a middle of the pack AD carry type of performance, regardless of what the KDA says. GIANTX was just completely out of his depth in the later half. If you're going to play Victor, you have to be good in team fights, and he just was not very good in the team fight stage of this game. Like, there were just issues with Vitality, but these are more expected issues, like Carzzy and Hilly being super flippy and inconsistent. Yeah, that happens. Like, that's exactly who they are as a duo. If you were expecting anything else, I don't know what to tell you. Nako being flippy, like, yeah, that's who he is as a player. He's very, very greedy, and when he wins, he's going to win hard, and when he loses, he's going to lose hard. He's much more in the mold of Adam than he is someone like a Broken Blade. And then, obviously, with Linsauce playing well, like, you would hope that you would be able to do something in the mid-game, but it just didn't really happen that way. Vitality's fine. They're sitting at 3 and 4, very similar to where I feel with Heretics. I think those two teams are kind of clumped together in my mind right now, but I think Vitality has a little bit more upside in terms of the players they brought in. And then for K-Corp on the other side, like, they just look excellent. Again, if they keep this pace up for the rest of the week and start taking down some of the tougher competition that they're going to be playing in week number 3, we could be talking about a team that is number 1 in my power rankings and is the favorite to win the league going into the playoffs. It's going to be very fun to watch, but right now, K-Corp looks excellent. But then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick off day 2 with maybe the matchup I was most excited for in a negative way. Rogue taking on SK Gaming, the two worst teams in the league going head-to-head. And SK Gaming is going to pick up their first win of the split. They're going to move to 1-7, and Rogue showing it's not just SK who is absolutely bottom of the barrel right now. They are right alongside them. They have the worst player in the LEC, who's having maybe the single worst split in the history of European League of Legends. And honestly, there's just not really a ton to talk about when it comes to Rogue. We know who they are. Even SK can end up taking advantage of that and walking to a win. This wasn't even a particularly close game. SK just kind of won early, which honestly, they've done a couple of times. It's not been particularly consistent, but early game is definitely their strength as a team. Both GIANTX and Isma, I think, are relatively good in the early game. Isma's a really good early game pather. I think he's somebody that actually would look a lot better on a different team, but GIANTX is fine as a laner, and Rahela is obviously able to win. The problem has been that they just can't close out games because other teams are just a lot more aggressive and a lot better at team fighting than they are. That's really a huge weakness of SK, but Rogue, not the kind of team that can take advantage of that. You would hope that a team with Larson and Patrick, if they ever were going to be in a good spot, would be the kind of team that survives early game and tries to play for these late game advantages. It's why they play so slow, but even then, they're not particularly good in these situations. And so Rogue is just falling apart. They're the worst team in the league right now. Even SK is able to outperform them. Player of the game should go to one of two players. It should go to either Isma or Rahel. I'm going to give it to Rahel for the Ezreal. It felt like he was a little bit better, I would say, in this game, and I think generally because his opposition on the other side was so bad, it kind of blew up how good Rahel's game was. It made him look even better. If you wanted to give this to Isma, I think that's also totally fair. It should go to one of those two players, either Rahel or Isma, and they've been the two players that I've been the most impressed by on SK throughout this split so far. Rahel is a good player. He's a really good AD carry that in a different situation would look a lot better. It's just not possible right now. There's nothing you can do on SK outside of being able to take advantage of someone like Patrick, but Rahel definitely did that on the Ezreal. And then for Isma, what I've kind of called him throughout basically his entire career is like budget Sheo. I continue to think that that's a pretty accurate comparison. He's really good in the early game. Like, his pathing is really solid. He does a good job at getting advantages for his laners in situations where his laners are actually halfway decent, which they have not been so far, but he just doesn't have really a clue on how to take over games in the later half. I think he did a much better job on something like the Wukong here, but again, Rogue just makes it way too easy to be able to establish pressure and, move forward early on in these games, so how much of that do I attribute to Isma? Not a ton, right? Like, Isma and Rahel played really well. I think they're both competent LEC players. Everybody else on this team was also fine, but they're the players that I think have really struggled. Loopy goes deathless on the Rakan, usually a really good sign, but when you're taking advantage of players like Patrick and Larson and Execute, who are just absolutely atrocious, then yeah, I mean, this is the kind of performance that you can put up. Still, that being said, this is easily his best game in the LEC so far. He has been a massive disappointment and a major downgrade to Luan. I think Reeker and GIANTX also were along for the ride. They still weren't exactly dominating. GIANTX wasn't even probably the better top laner in this game, although I think that's kind of up for debate, but SK still has a lot of problems, right? These solo laners are still incompetent. You took advantage of the worst player in the LEC at the current moment, which has been very much determined by this series. Like, I'm not going to completely flip my idea of what SK is as a team just because of this win, but it is true that players like Rahel and Isma do have some level of upside if things were to go right elsewhere, or if the enemy team were to just kind of give them free advantages like Rogue did here. And Rogue is just awful. If this doesn't prove that they are the worst team in the league, I don't know what does. SK was so far and away the worst team in the LEC, and Rogue kind of got slaughtered by them again. I know it's a best of one, but it's just frustrating to see this. Adam is kind of in the Rahel position now, where he's just mega stuck on this team. He's trying his absolute best to be able to win some of these games, and he just can't do it. And obviously, this is a major test of patience and fortitude for a player that has been known for his off-the-rift toxicity for basically his entire career. For him to be put on this team where he has Larson and Patrick and even Execute to a lesser extent just completely running him down every single game, I can't even imagine what the behind the scenes looks like for this organization, but Adam was not the problem. Hell, even Malrang has really not been the problem on this team. He was awful in the CBLOL last year, but he's not been like a major issue. He's just kind of been along for the ride. He's certainly not adding to this team. I think Isma, even on the other side of this, has probably been better in terms of the execution throughout this year, but Malrang has not been horrible. It's been Larson and Patrick in particular that have just been awful, and Patrick is once again going to get dud of the game. This is their 7th game loss of the year. This is his 6th dud of the game, and honestly, the one I didn't give him was day 1 here, where he goes 0-3-0 in a game where Rogue had all of the pressure in the world in the early game. Somehow, some way, he's still not able to participate in a single kill. Like, is this the worst split ever from any player in the history of the LEC? I think you could absolutely make the argument this guy just doesn't exist. He's not making any positive plays. He's making an absolute ton of negative plays. Like, this is maybe the worst graded major league split I've ever seen. This is as bad, if not worse, than what someone like Taiyun was putting out in the LCK for so long on the Guangdong Freaks. It's actually absurd. There is no way this guy goes into spring still as a starter in the LEC. There's just no way you can make that argument to me that he deserves to still have that spot with how he has played so far. The only reason that I think it could be possible is because Rogue is a broke organization, and I'm not sure they want to buy out Patrick and bring on another AD carry, but the fact that Jack Spectra has to sit there and cast these games where Patrick is getting a paycheck right now in the LEC, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's kind of frustrating if all things are being honest, but it is what it is. Again, Patrick just has not been good for a little while. The downward trajectory was very steep, very fast, and he has been even worse than what Comp was last year, and Comp was already the worst AD carry in the league, and so That's not good. Execute has really not been good. Again, it's hard to get a real judge of him because his AD carry is just completely non-existent, but he's not been particularly good, and he wasn't good last year for Sandbox in the LCK either. Larson, we've already talked about it, is just inept. He doesn't do anything. He sits on the map and plays super slow. When Reeker is outpacing you, that is a problem, and even if Adam is playing well, Rogue just doesn't have a chance in hell of being relevant this year. This basically cements them in the bottom two. And then for SK, at least you got one win. Like, that's definitely a positive. I don't imagine things go up from here, and this is still a team that is going to be in the bottom two that will not be making the best of three stage, but hopefully this is at least a sign that you have a couple of players that you can build around if things were to go well. I don't really know where you go from here. If you're SK, your solo laners still aren't particularly impressive. I don't think Lupi has still been particularly impressive, but a win is a win at the end of the day. Then moving on to game number 2 here of day number 2, and this was an absolute fiesta, but an absolute banger. It's Team BDS taking on GIANTX, and GIANTX is going to walk away with the win, but man, was it looking real close for most of this game. This was a very fun one. I honestly don't want anything more out of my LEC games than whatever this was, an absolute clown fiesta where GX gets an absolutely ginormous early game lead and then proceeds to lose multiple fights and lose multiple objectives and let BDS get back into this game, not really have any idea of how to close things out. The gold lead actually shrinks into something super manageable for BDS, and then of course GIANTX just ends up winning the team fight in the end to win the game at the end of the day. It's just a really, really fun game. Go watch this if you haven't. It really is like peak Western League of Legends. This is kind of what I want to see domestically from my Western teams, especially from the ones that aren't expected to be competing for like major international trophies. I don't need to see the cleanest games in the world. I want to see the funnest games in the world, and that's what both teams offered here. GX really needs to clean up their mid game. It's like actually horrendous how bad they are at closing out games, and you know, their macro's okay. Like, they understand how to play the map, and they certainly understand how to get leads on this map with their macro in that way, but it's just, it's a nightmare right now trying to figure out how to close things out and trying to not get caught in a lot of pivotal situations. But for BDS on the other side, you know, great resilience, I would say, overall from this team. They are showing why I think it was right to keep them in the top 6 of my power rankings, and why I do think they still deserve to be there. They're just not a complete team, and unfortunately, if their early games were even existent in any form or fashion, they would probably be relevant, but this was never a particularly good early game team, even last year when they were, you know, a world caliber team. And so, you know, BDS definitely has some issues that they have yet to fix, but let's go ahead and talk about GX first and foremost. Player of the game is going to go to Noah. I don't really see how this could possibly go to anybody else. The Kalista was definitely the most relevant champion in this game. Noah's mechanics on this champ are also absolutely phenomenal. Like, there are a couple of champs that I think of when I think of Noah. Aphelios is definitely one of the first ones that comes to mind, but Kalista is definitely up there in that same vein. If he does want to play a bit more aggressive in the early game, Kalista is often the pick for him, and you know what? It very much worked in this one. I think if they didn't have Noah playing as well as he did on the Kalista, this is probably a loss. Like, he actually just was like carrying every single team fight. He was free hitting in the backline. Nobody was touching him throughout the entirety of the back half of this game, and if that's not the case, again, I'm not sure anybody else on this team played well enough for them to be able to take over. So credit to Noah. This bot lane continues to look really good when they're not facing the other best bot lanes in the entire league. Jun was really solid in that same vein on the Gragas. I actually really like when these two in particular pull out a lot of the weird supports, because I think they function on them better than other players do. Not like Gragas is like the weirdest thing in the world, just that isn't exactly the most meta thing in the world right now either. So Kalista Gragas really ended up working. I want to give some credit to Closer. I think the Nocturne ultimates were actually effective, if only for the fact that it created panic amongst BDS, and that, you know, turning off the lights actually made it a lot more difficult for someone like a Maokai or an Mbessa or a Varus to really operate in the way that they would want to. So credit to Closer in that front. Lot was fine. Really wasn't like a huge positive or huge negative, but Jackie's honestly tried his best to throw this game. I know the scoreline looks okay, and his damage was really good in these team fights. I'm not going to criticize him too heavily. There have been significantly worse performances this week on winning teams, but at some point you gotta like try not to get picked off. Like, this is one of those comps that's really designed to try to find one member of the enemy team and blow them up, and oftentimes it was the Orianna. Jackie's wasn't doing a particularly good job at playing defensive, but that's never really been his specialty, and so again, it's just something that I think he needs to clean up, and this team in general just needs to clean up their late game macro. They really don't know how to close out games in a clean and concise way. If they can figure that out, they're still going to be a very good team, but I think 5 very much looks accurate for them, and 6, like I said, does look accurate for BDS, even though they fall to 3 and 5 after this loss. it does just kind of feel like BDS is one of those teams that has really strong strengths and really weak weaknesses. Their late games are still really good, and they're still able to pull back a lot of situations that they really shouldn't be able to pull back. Both Nuke and Ice are late game players. Ice in particular is definitely much more of a late game AD carry. We saw that for BDS last year. They were putting him on hyper carries and just kind of asking him to be the guy in that regard. I think 113 and Irrelevant have both kind of adopted that mentality as well, and it creates these situations where, while their early games are pretty awful, especially in comparison to most of the other like middle table teams in the league, like Heretics or Vitality right now, even GIANTX on the other side, if you want to consider them mid-table. Their early games are much worse than those teams. They actually are more consistent at being able to play from behind than basically any other team around them in the standings. The issue was just that it got to the point where it was just a hands check, where everybody had resources, and they ended up losing that one. I do think there were some good performances. I think generally 113 has played significantly better over the past couple of games than he did at the start. It feels like he is getting comfortable playing in the LEC again. Paris is feeling a lot more comfortable as well, but dud of the game to me was pretty obvious. It's going to go to Irrelevant. He was doing a lot of damage on the Rumble, but if he was just a little bit safer in some of these fights, I do actually think they maybe win them. Noah was just completely gliding him out and just making it impossible for the Rumble to play, and he was dying so fast, taking so much damage so early on in a lot of these skirmishes that he was basically not a champion in this later half of the game, and they needed him. A lot of their gold was on Irrelevant, and he just didn't really do enough in the back half here. He's not been particularly good this split. There have been a lot of top laners that are just better than Irrelevant right now, and I'm not going to try to take a victory lap on that. Irrelevant's always been a pretty inconsistent player, kind of a feast or famine player. He's not even really been that. He's kind of just been a weak side top laner that's not really generating advantages and isn't particularly good in the later half of the game. Like, this is maybe the worst Irrelevant has looked at the LEC level for an extended period of time, and that's not super encouraging to me. You know, we'll see what ends up happening with him. Hopefully he can start getting some of those great performances from the SK days back. You know, I wanted him to get more consistent. I didn't mean in this regard, but at the end of the day, like, BDS is BDS. Nuke and Ice are going to be able to carry some games. Nuke in particular has been the main character for BDS. It feels like 113 and Paris are locking in, and they played well here. It just wasn't enough because of their early game deficits. They're a very predictable team in terms of how they play, but for GIANTX, if they can clean up some of those late game problems and just capitalize on their good laning phases, they're really good early game macro, which is some of the best in the entire league, then I do think this team could still be a threat. We saw in week 1 what this team could be at their absolute best. They haven't quite been that in a little while, and this win is definitely shaky, but you know, there definitely is still a lot of hope and a lot of things to point to in a performance like this that give you confidence that they could get better moving forward. But then moving on now to game number 3 of day 2, our middle game of the entire weekend, our game of the week. Certainly the one I was the most excited for. It's Fnatic taking on Corp, the top 2 teams right now in the LEC, and Fnatic is going to get one over, and quite frankly, it wasn't even remotely close. Fnatic is so far and away the best team in the LEC right now, and honestly, it's just so much fun to watch. Can you imagine going into this year expecting Fnatic to look the way that they have looked so far? It's all 5 members. It's everybody for Fnatic that has really been sensational. It feels like they have been unlocked with someone like Mickey X coming in to be their primary shot caller, with someone like Upset being a much more decisive carry in the later half of some of these games. You have carries like Razork and Humanoid that were already performing well for Fnatic that feel like they are having like a whole new resurgence right now. I think, you know, we'll talk about it, but a lot of them have slotted into the roles that I think they are the most comfortable filling right now, and it's made this team feel ridiculous. Their macro is by far the best in the league. For Corp, this is definitely a pretty devastating loss. This is certainly the worst this team has looked so far in 2025. I think it was okay to lose a game like this. Fnatic is really good. It's a best of 1. You don't want to panic all that much because of how good they've looked across the other series so far this year, but you wanted it to be close. You didn't want it to be this absolute slaughter that it absolutely was here. Fnatic was better in every single way, and that is definitely a bit concerning when it comes to Corp, but we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to them. Player of the game, come on, it's gotta be Razork. This was a truly unbelievable performance, and I put him at number 1 in terms of my jungle rankings. I'm pretty sure everybody had him at number 1. If you didn't, I don't really know what to tell you. Like, Razork last year was the best jungler in the LEC. He really shored up a lot of his weaknesses, which mostly in the past was playing from behind, right? Like, not being able to play without resources, and He was much better at that, I would say, in 2024, but I think really the big thing that kind of tilted that over the edge is he just didn't lose in the early game in 2024. He didn't have to get better at playing from behind if he never had to play from behind. Like, he just was always playing with a lead in 2024, and it allowed him to really do a lot of the aggressive moves that he liked to do in the mid game. I think that's even more exacerbated with this new map in 2025. This dude is, like, legit unreal. I think this is the best Razork has ever played. 2024 going into 2025, we're watching the prime of Razork's career, in my opinion. And he decimated Corp. He was everywhere on the map. He was dominating early. He was dominating in the mid game. He was dominating in the late game. Like, it wasn't particularly close. This was truly an MVP, like, #1 player in the region type of performance from currently, in my opinion, the best player on the best team in the league. So credit to Razork. He's doing really well. Oscar Rinnan has been awesome. Like, I really want to point this out. I've been an Oscar hater, quite frankly. I've certainly been an Oscar doubter in terms of the consistency that he offers. I think he's been propped up quite a bit by getting to play for Fnatic, who just kind of makes everything a lot easier. But you know what? He has kind of proven me wrong so far to start 2025. He's been one of the better top laners in the league. He's been hyper consistent as this weak side top laner that can receive pressure, that doesn't necessarily need resources, and is still very relevant in the back half of these games. I really like the way that Oscar has started off the split. Going into Kana, who's maybe been the best performing top laner in the entire LEC, like, this was an amazing time to have what was maybe his best game of the entire split. Upset and Mickey continued to be excellent. Mickey in particular was awesome on the Rakan. Humanoid was very good on the Aurora, and like I said, everybody just kind of falling into their natural place. Razork as an early game facilitator to play for lanes that are winning. Upset as the primary resource gatherer, somebody who can, you know, carry in the late game on these hyper carries like the Kai'Sa that can really take over once we get to these later team fights, and Humanoid as a secondary carry that isn't relied upon to be the option to decide whether Fnatic wins or loses. One of the big problems that Fnatic has run into in previous years is that Humanoid is just a very flippy player. You don't know what you're going to get out of him from a game-to-game basis. There will be stretches where he doesn't play well, but if he's not your #1 option, then all of a sudden that becomes significantly less of a problem, because you can just play for Upset, or you can just play for Oscar, you can play for Razork to be a carry. Like, if you have more options than just playing for Humanoid in the mid lane, all of a sudden, like, the problems with Humanoid end up becoming significantly less oppressive for Fnatic to be able to try and overcome. I think this roster is just built extremely well. I wouldn't have said that in the offseason, but everything has really worked out for them, and they are the best team in the LEC. They proved that right here. And then for Corp on the other side, like, this is unfortunate. You obviously would have hoped that this would have gone a bit differently. Dud of the game could go to quite a few people. I think it should go to one of the carry duo, either Vladi or Kaliste. I think both of them were pretty bad in this game. I'm going to give it to Kaliste because it felt like he was just even less impactful than someone like Vladi was in the mid lane. At least the Azir was, like, trying to operate. He just wasn't in a particularly good spot to be able to do that. If you wanted to give it to Vladi, I think that's fair. If you wanted to give it to Targamas on the Leona, I also think that that's relatively fair. Even the Yike on the Xin Zhao, I think is also fair. But Kaliste to me kind of stood out for being just non-existent. Like, and first of all, how do you play this if you're Ezreal? You're, like, constantly in a position where you have to play as safe as possible, but his damage is, like, nowhere in this game. It's actually absurd how little he was able to do. Again, I'm not trying to pile onto Kaliste. There are very few players in the world that could do anything in this game on Ezreal, and maybe that list is even 0, right? Like, maybe there aren't any ADCs in the world that could do anything, but that's part of the game, man. Like, if you aren't able to do anything, then you're probably gonna get dead of the game. But it was everyone. Vladi got completely gapped in the mid lane, was nothing in the later half of the game on this Azir. Targamas had easily his worst game of 2025 so far. Yike got completely out-jungled. Kana, for the first time, felt like he was overmatched on the top side. Just wasn't good for Corp. Like, you wanted to see more out of this team. Again, I'm not going to panic too much. I'm not going to drop them to number, 3 or 4 in my power rankings just based off of this loss, even though it was pretty decisive because Fnatic really is that good. But this needs to turn around. We need to see a better performance out of them on the final day of the regular season. And this is phenomenal for Fnatic. This is the best team in the LEC until proven otherwise. And I think this win really solidifies that. Razork is on incredible pace. Like I said, this is the best he's ever been. This is the prime of his career that we are getting to watch. Upset feels reinvigorated. Mickey has completely changed the dichotomy of this team in terms of their macro. Everything is just working. Fnatic looks so good right now. Then moving on to our 4th game of day number 2, and it's a battle between 2 of the teams with some of the highest upside in the league. It's Team Heretics taking on Team Vitality. And Vitality is going to pick up a win, kind of proving that their young roster experiment is just a little bit further along than Heretics is right now, and I think we kind of expected that coming into the year. They have a lot of veterans on the team, or 2 veterans on the team, that I just think are a little bit more guaranteed than the 2 veterans over on Heretics. I feel better about Karzi and Hylissang than I do about Sheo and Flacket. I feel better about some of the young players for Vitality like Knock than I do about players like Carlson and Camelou over on Heretics, and I think all of that kind of came to fruition here for Vitality with their win. But again, it's the veterans that are really carrying them across the board. Not carrying them, because Vitality was good everywhere, but this was Hylissang's game. He's going to get player of the game. It wasn't particularly close. We know things are good when Hylissang walks out of a game with 0 deaths. That means something has gone incredibly right for him, and you know what? It went very, very right. He was everywhere on the map, really creating on this Rakan, his best champion, and really just making a gigantic impact. Again, not entirely surprising to see Hylissang be able to take over a game against a team like Heretics that just doesn't have a defined sense of macro just yet, but it is still encouraging. We've seen a couple of games out of Hylissang that have been really good across this split. He has definitely been the player to watch, I would say, on Vitality, if you don't count Knock, who's just the player to watch for different reasons, not for bad reasons, just because he's so flippy, he is so aggressive, and he is constantly looking to try and generate advantages. Like, Hylissang has been the best player on Vitality in their wins, and I think that that continues here with yet another good performance. Karzi obviously did a good job following up, but honestly, I haven't really thought all that much about Karzi across this split so far. He's really not been all that much of a factor for Vitality, and with the amount of AD carries that I think have taken center stage in the LEC so far at the start of 2025, like, Karzi has definitely flown a lot more under the radar. That could be a good thing. That could be a sign of consistency. He's just not having those breakout great performances that he's been having in previous years. Like, typically you'd have to take the good with the bad. When it came to Karzi, now you're just kind of settling for the neutral, the average, and I think that that's okay with how this team is set up, but he's not really been the primary option here, and it's something that I'm curious to see what happens moving forward. Chayak was excellent here on the Yone, had a really good late game, and definitely took advantage of a Smolder that didn't really have ways to be able to get out of hard CC and lockdown. Linsauce has had a really good week so far. He kind of just out-jungled Sheo in basically every capacity. Linsauce is really progressing well. I'm really happy to see that. Knock continues to be really fun on the top side. He's the more interesting of these 2 top lane rookies coming up from the ERLs, and so Vitality just has a lot of cool things going for them. Hylissang is really fun to watch, and I think Linsauce in particular is really starting to develop as a really nice complementary piece on this team. Vitality's in a decent spot. They're not like a game-breaking team, but they're certainly good enough to be able to compete for a top 5 or top 6 spot if everything were to go right. And then for Heretics on the other side, they just don't really have the firepower to actually take down teams that are genuinely good just yet. They have pieces here, but when your veteran players aren't performing well, it's probably not going to be a particularly good time. Sheo's going to get dud of the game. I mean, just not a very good Taliyah performance. Having a 0% KP against Linsauce and against Vitality when you are the jungler in particular is just really bad. Like, that's not a situation you can fall into, and it's frustrating because he had such a good day number 1 this week, but didn't follow it up quite all that well on the Taliyah. Don't really love this draft either. I think Varus is yet again in a position where he's going to have trouble really accomplishing anything, and for that, Flacket almost got dud of the game for me. I don't think he played particularly well, but he was at least a little bit more involved, I would say, than the Taliyah was. Stend was fine. Camelou was fine. I mean, Smolder obviously had a rough time of it towards the back half here because there are so many ways to just get on the Smolder with the Ambessa, with the Rakan, with the Yone. There are so many ways to make sure this dragon doesn't get out of control in the middle of the map, but Camelou, I think, individually did as much as he could. Carlson is a complete non-factor on the top side. This guy is yet to be good or bad at the LEC level. I wouldn't say he's been good. I wouldn't even say he's been average. He's definitely been a below average top laner. He's not really showing a ton of highlight moments right now, but at least he's not completely running games down. Like, he's not the one actively losing them a lot of games. He's just kind of been a nothing burger on the top side, which we kind of expected. And again, Camelou has a lot of time that he needs to go through in order to get a little bit more comfortable at this level. If Sheo and Flacket are going to be the 2 players that aren't performing for Heretics, they're just not going to win games. Like, that's just not how things are going to go here. But, you know, there still is upside. They've already proven they're better than the bottom 2, and they are going to make the best of 3 stage, which is definitely encouraging, but they're not as good as Vitality, or they're certainly not on the track right now that Vitality is on. I'm not saying that they couldn't get there throughout the rest of this year, but Vitality is clearly just further along. Hylissang is a player that can really take advantage of teams that don't have concrete, clear macro, and that's what happened here. I think Linsauce has really turned into a pretty solid jungler. Knock is obviously a very intriguing top laner. Karzi is stabilized on the bot side, even if he doesn't have those highs, and Chayak was really good here. I think Vitality has a lot of good things going for them. They're sitting at 500. Again, this could be a top 5, top 6 team if you really wanted to go that route. I think the inconsistencies are still definitely a little bit concerning to me, and it's not like Heretics is the scariest team in the world to end up beating, but still, getting the job done against teams you should be able to beat, that's the mark of a team that deserves to be considered upper mid-table. But then moving on to our fifth and final game of day number 2, our middle day, and it's another really important matchup between top teams, G2 Esports taking on Movistar KOI. And G2 is going to pick up another decisive victory. This one significantly better, in my opinion, than their win over Rogue. Not that their win over Rogue was as horrific as I guess it could have been. Rather, just it felt entirely out of their control. They lost in the early game, didn't really have control of why Rogue ended up throwing that game away, and, ended up performing well, but coming back in a situation where it didn't really feel like it was them making a lot of the big plays. It was Rogue making a lot of big plays in a bad way. And this was the complete opposite. This was their game. They completely controlled it from moment one, and they carried that through into a really decisive victory. What I needed to see out of G2 was a good early game, and that's exactly what they gave us in this one. For KOI on the other side, there are real concerns about KOI. This is not a perfect team. I was concerned after day number 1. I'm even more concerned after day number 2 now, because it does feel like some of the flaws that this roster has are being exposed a bit. The inconsistencies are definitely there, and they kind of just got outplayed across the board. I do think that there are reasons to believe that KOI could still make this miraculous run, but I don't know if they're favorites to be a top 3 or a top 4 team after something like this, after the performances that they've given so far in week number 3, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go along. But for G2 player of the game, it's not even a competition. It's got to go to Labrov in the support position. Easily the best game that he has played in a G2 uniform. We have been waiting for Labrov James to show back up, for this guy to really be that #1 support that he was supposed to be going into the year. I mean, he went from BDS to G2 because, G2 was like, he's better than Mickey X. He was better than Mickey X last year, and he would be an upgrade to our team. That has not been the case so far. Week 1 was really, really problematic for him. He really struggled. Week 2, things got better, and now in week 3, it really feels like he has locked in, gotten comfortable with the shot calling, and is now super aggressive in the mid game. I think he's had to change up his style quite a bit from what he was on BDS. That team last year was really team fight focused, really 5v5 focused, and Labrov was the best support in the entire region at doing that. But I think this G2 team definitely needs a little bit more early game direction, and I think Labrov just being more aggro and just understanding that he needs to do that, that's going to help out a ton. He's never really been an early game focused support, but he's good enough to be able to do whatever he needs to do. He's well-rounded enough where he isn't just a one style type of player, and I think if he is going to take more of an early game approach because that's what G2 needs, then that is just going to help them overall. So a fantastic aggressive game from Labrov, easily the best player on the map here on the Leona. But I want to give a huge shout out to Skumond, because I think this might also be his best game so far on G2. I've been very critical of Skumond because I'm going to be honest, I just don't think he's been particularly good this year. I think the first 2 weeks of the season were really below average for him, not just in terms of the expectations for G2 and the expectations he had coming into the split, but because legit he was the 8th or 9th best jungler in the league. He was genuinely underperforming in basically every trackable metric, and certainly the ones I tracked, they were not, particularly positive towards Skumond, but I think he is, again, starting to figure things out. I think if Labrov is going to be more active around the map earlier on in games, that should make Skumond's job a lot easier. He's always been much more of a team fighter than he has been an early game player. That does fit the G2 mentality, but I think getting that help and that assistance to get through the early game is going to get him to the part of the game where he can take over a bit more, like he did here on the Wukong. He was excellent. Hansama was really good, definitely the better of these 280 carries. Caps continues to be a major positive. We were waiting for the Caps Jojo Pune matchup. That was one I was really looking forward to. It didn't necessarily live up to the hype because they weren't kind of the focal points of their individual teams here, but still, Cap's doing a good job of being able to generate leads, and Broken Blade was great as a weak side tank. Mirwin has been really good, but he was off of Ambessa and Cassante in this one, and that means that he has to go to a champion that he's a little bit worse at in the Gwen. So, credit to Broken Blade, credit to G2. They had a good draft strategy, and generally it feels like these players are just getting more comfortable playing with each other. If Labrov and Skumond are going to start performing really well to the level we anticipated, this team is going to be back in #1 discussions a lot quicker than I think a lot of people are anticipating. And then for KOI on the other side, this is just the nature of the inconsistency of this team. They just got outplayed. I'm worried about the middle of the map here, Elyoya and Jojo Pune. I think this is one of those duos that could definitely fall apart if things start to be a little bit more problematic. Jojo is inherently a lot more flippy than a lot of the other players on this team. We saw what happened to Mirwin when he was taken off of the Cassante and the Ambessa. That is definitely a concern for me with this team, but Supa is going to get my dud of the game. Just didn't get to do anything on the Varus, very similar to why I gave Dud of the game to Kaliste earlier this day against Fnatic, where you're playing Varus, you're in a situation where you don't really have a lot of, great targets to hit. You've got an Ornn and a Leona and a Wukong standing in front of you, and there really aren't a lot of ways to get through them, especially when the Wukong gets super fed and when Labrov is doing as much as he is, and Supa just ends up being the one to kind of perish early in a lot of these fights. The mobility is not there, the protection from the rest of the team is not there. It just wasn't a great performance from Supa, but it was everybody. Once again, like, I considered giving this to Jojo. I considered giving this to Mirwin. Elyoya, I think, was generally fine, but Skewmon completely out-jungled him. Labrov basically out-jungled Elyoya in this game. Alvaro was definitely outplayed. So KOI has their issues, and I think we're starting to see those exposed a bit. They have very much fallen outside of the top 3 in terms of my mentality after these first 2 days. It's just kind of a question of whether or not they're going to fall further, depending on how the rest of the week goes. And then for G2, important win here, and not just beating KOI, but winning in the way that they did, with the players stepping up who stepped up, with Labrov and Skewmon being kind of the driving forces in this win. You needed to see something like this. You needed to know that this was still inside for G2, and I think they proved that here. This can still be a team that dominates Europe, that wins every single split like they did last year. They just need to be able to get a lot of their bigger question marks under control, and I think this was a huge and the biggest step in that direction that they've taken all split so far. But that's going to bring us to our third and final day of LEC action here in week number 3, and our final regular season day of the winter split. We kicked it off with a matchup between Team Vitality and GIANTX. That Team Vitality is going to pick up a very important win in. GX has not necessarily been on the up and up over the last couple of weeks. It feels like this team has really started to run into some problems. A lot of their weaknesses are being exposed a bit more. Players like Jun and Noah, who were dominating in the early weeks, they've kind of returned to normalcy. Their breakouts have not necessarily been as prolonged as maybe you would have wanted, and you've gotten some regression, I would say, from some of the players that are supposed to be the stars on this team, but Vitality still does a phenomenal job of being able to take advantage of the weaknesses of the enemy team. And you know what? This young group, it's like really starting to look interesting. We said that they could be top 5. This is the kind of win that really gets you into those top 5 conversations, which is really nice. But it was Noah and Jun that were taking a lot of the headlines at the start of the year. It's Carzzy and Hylissang who are taking the headlines for this game. Hylissang is going to get my player of the game, but I think it could very well go to Carzzy. I think both of them played excellent here. I'm giving it to Hilly because I thought the creation was just a little bit flashier. In all honesty, that's really the only kind of deciding tiebreaker. I think Carzzy played easily his best game of the entire split. I think Hilly has been the best player on Vitality across this split. It's not particularly close. Basically, every single one of their wins was created with Hylissang doing something pretty ridiculous in terms of his mid-game prowess, as we know from Hylissang, but I think this was the first time where it really felt like they were playing towards Carzzy in particular as a primary damage carry, rather than either Chayak or Knock-Knocko, who have really been the two that they wanted to get going in a lot of the later half of these games. Carzzy has been really good at Ezreal for a really long time. That's not a giant surprise to anybody who follows the LEC, but it is good to see that he can still do it, and he can do it against really good competition. Again, even though Noah and Jun aren't exactly playing in the same way that they did at the beginning of the split, they still are a very good bot lane. Like, the floor of them is still very high, and Carzzy and Hilly just completely outplayed them. Vitality is carried right now by the strength of their bot lane, and to me, from a total package perspective, this might have been their best performance of the entire split up until this point, because while Hylissang has been creating, I don't know if Carzzy has felt like that superstar ADC up until this game, but this was the performance where you look at it and go, that's the good Carzzy that we remember. That's the Carzzy that can really break out in the right situation. I think everybody else in this team is still really good. Knock-Knocko continues to really impress. Going up against Lot, again, another promotion on the top side here, another top laner that was promoted from the ERLs. Knock-Knocko continues to be the one, mechanically speaking, that is really intriguing to watch. Lot has not been nearly as effective as he was in week 1 throughout the rest of this split. Knock-Knocko has definitely gained a lot of notoriety for a lot of the highlight plays. If he can clean up some of the mistakes, he's still going to be fantastic. Linsauce had a great week. Chayak was definitely better than Jackie's on the other side of this, which was necessary for Vitality to be able to win this one. Overall, it's just another good performance. Hylissang looks like a star right now for Vitality. Like, this is looking like it's going to be a very good year for him individually, and if Carzzy is going to have more games that are like this rather than the more average performances we've seen, in my opinion, so far in winter, that's ginormous for Vitality. And then for GX on the other side, things are not going well. 5-4 to end the regular season. Same for Vitality on the other side, but their 5-4 is not exactly all that telling. Like, 4 of those wins were through the first 5 series, if I am to be believed. I believe I'm correct on that. I think they went 4-1 to start the year, and they've been 1-3 ever since. It's really not been a good second half for GX, and again, a lot of their flaws are starting to get exposed. This team is just not particularly good at playing the late game. They're really not a team that I trust in that regard, and I think if you don't get really good individual performances out of a couple of these players, like, I don't think their macro is what was separating them. I think it was their individual skill levels, and so when they have off days, it's just difficult to imagine this team being able to carry that into victories. Jackie's is a very easy choice for dead of the game. This is a very poor Jackie's performance. I'd love to sit here and say that this is coming out of nowhere, but Jackie's had a lot of games like this last year. I think people just want to forget them. He was like this for the most part throughout all of spring in 2024. He really struggled to be able to find consistency up until the summer split, where it really felt like he broke out, and while he has been good so far this split, this was a showing that a lot of those negative performances, a lot of the times where it feels like he's outmatched from a mental perspective, like mid-game and onwards, that's not gone. That has not just been entirely fixed by the fact that he was playing well in the summer split. If he isn't able to generate a gigantic gold lead, sometimes he is just actually a detriment to his team in the back half, and he absolutely was a detriment here. I also think Noah and Jun just weren't good enough. If Jackie's, Noah, and Jun aren't playing well, this team is not going to win games. As much as I like Lot, and as much as I think Closer has been fine across this year so far, they're not stars. They're not going to be the players that push this team forward. If Jackie's is underperforming, if Noah and Jun are underperforming, this team will lose against basically anybody else in the LEC. Noah and Jun have not been nearly as dynamic as they were in that week 1. I've talked about it a lot in this segment already, but it's mostly Jun who was easily far and away the single best player in the LEC in week 1 and just has kind of been a guy for the rest of the split. It's definitely frustrating to watch, but he got completely outplayed by Hylissang here, and it wasn't particularly close. Noah wasn't particularly relevant on the Misfortune. Again, when you have your, like, big trio for GX and Jackie's, Noah, and Jun underperforming, it's just not going to look good. And that's even with both Lot and Closer, I think, playing fine. It was the 3 players you expected to be good for this team that ended up letting them down. But GX has to figure something out quick. They're going to be going into this best of 3 stage with a lot less momentum, I think, than a lot of other teams, including a team like Vitality on the other side of this. We'll see what happens to a team like BDS. Hell, a team like Heretics could also make some interesting things happen. Like, there are a lot of other teams that I think have interesting storylines, we'll just say, going into the playoffs, interesting momentum. GX is not one of them. They are ice cold right now in comparison to the rest of the league, and that's something they're going to have to overcome. But for Vitality on the other side, I like where this team is headed. I don't know how consistent this is going to be against teams that actually are performing well. A big reason why Vitality was allowed to get away with this is because Jackie's, Noah, and Jun were underperforming. I think a really good comparison, for those of you who watch my LCK weekly recaps, a very good comparison for how Vitality is playing right now is Nongshim over in the LCK, Nongshim Red Force, where their support is so aggro that they're going to go out and make plays, and against teams that really struggle to be able to keep up with that, if the support is just the best player on the Rift, they're going to be able to walk to a lot of these victories. But against teams that have good macro, that have good players that can contest a lot of this early aggression, oftentimes they're just not going to generate the same kind of tempo. I think Vitality is probably going to fall into a similar vein, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Knock Knock Go and Chayek and Linsas, Karzi to a lesser extent, because we know he's going to be fine. Maybe they are going to rise above expectations and actually bring this team, real success in the winter. But I think this is a team that's going to do really well beating the teams that beat themselves, and that's what GX was here. Then moving on to game number 2 here of day number 3, and it's a merciful end to one of the weaker teams in the league. It was Movistar KOI taking on Rogue, and of course KOI is going to pick up the victory. That really wasn't in all that much of doubt. That wasn't in jeopardy in any sort of way, but Rogue is put out of their misery at 1-8. They will be done here for the rest of the winter split. I imagine changes will be happening. Truly, I would be stunned if they run back this group of 5 for the next split, not just because it underperformed here, but because there's no real reasonable way to expect this to get better moving forward. It's not even like SK Gaming, where a lot of these players were just given, new shots in the league, and we're seeing if they can, grow and adjust and get used to playing in the LEC again. No, this is a player that has just been on the downturn for quite a while and just needs to be replaced. So, we'll quickly go over it, but we've already talked mostly about it in this video already. Player of the game here is going to go to Supa. You don't need me to tell you there was a gigantic ADC gap in this one. Obviously, there was a gigantic ADC gap in this one, but Supa getting back on track after what I thought was a little bit of a rough day number 2. I think things could have been better for KOI at the beginning of this week, but generally speaking, it's just a game against Rogue that gets everybody right here in the LEC. It's what everybody basically needs in order to get themselves back on track, and I think Supa was definitely the most impressive player on KOI here on the Ziggs. I always love when he plays these more AP mages down in the bot lane. I actually think he's really good in that regard, but does a really good job of getting picks and being able able to capitalize on a lot of the things that both Elyoya and Alvaro created. Alvaro and Elyoya were also excellent in this one. I don't want to understate how good they were. Alvaro in particular looking really solid on the rel. I think a lot of people aren't talking about Supa and Alvaro as a top 2 or a top 3 bot lane in the LEC, and I think at this point, there's really no other way to look. To me, right now, at least in terms of production and performance, Upset and Mickey X are kind of the bot lane to beat in the LEC, but Supa and Alvaro aren't particularly far away from that in terms of what you could expect, and they certainly have a pretty decent track record, especially with how they played at Worlds this previous year. I mean, they're awesome. I've been singing their praises even before they played a single game in the LEC, so it's good to see them live up to that. Elyoya was good. Malring was also good on the other side of this. Easily the best player on Rogue in this matchup, but, you know, not much he could do. Elyoya was still very active on the Sedge. Mirwin, Jojo Pune, they both looked good. It's good to see KOI win a game without having to play either Mbessa or Cassante on the top side. They were, you know, they were allowed to play the Jace, and they were allowed to be a bit more aggressive, and Mirwin wasn't entirely punished for that, which is a good thing, especially against a player like Adam that I think has the potential to be able to punish him for that, but he ends up picking the Scion and not being particularly useful. Jojo doesn't run it down either. In the mid lane, Larson, not the player to ever take advantage of Jojo's overstepping his, aggressive tendencies. So KOI was just basically given a free win here, and they took it. They looked really good, but we'll see what happens going into playoffs. They're still not exactly off of thin ice from me, but this was a necessary win. And then for Rogue on the other side, I honestly just want to keep this brief because there's nothing I can say that I haven't already said in this video. Patrick is dud of the game. I would be stunned if he comes back in spring. This is maybe the worst season we've ever seen from an LEC player. It's certainly the worst split that we have ever seen from a player in this new format, like this 3-split format since Winter Split started existing. I just can't remember a time where anybody played worse than what Patrick played like this year. We'll see what happens moving forward, but it was bad. Like, Execute hasn't been much better. We'll see if he even returns, because he has been miserable. Larson is just a complete non-factor in the mid lane. He's a KDA player. This KDA is awful, and his KDA doesn't even look good over the course of this entire split. He just isn't, like, useful. He's actively been a detriment to this team. Malrang was pretty solid in this game, and I would say that he's not really been the problem. Adam is certainly not the problem. I absolutely think he can win you games, as he has done the past couple of years. Rogue just has a roster issue, and you know, we kind of knew that that was a possibility coming into this. These role player teams full of players who have never played together, it just doesn't necessarily always work out, and that was definitely the case here. We'll see what changes they make, but good win for KOI. You know, good job to get them into the playoffs, I guess, at 6-3. I think that they were probably hoping for a slightly better record heading into the best of 3 stage, but at the very least, they're going to get the chance to prove that they deserve to be in that upper echelon, that top 4, that I think there is more questions about now than there was going into the week. But then moving on to the third game of day number 3, and it's yet another very intriguing outcome. It's K-Corp taking on BDS. And BDS is going to pick up the win here. They're going to move to 4-5, and they're going to show a lot of really good things in this game. Their style is very much starting to become very obvious. I think it is very clear what their game plan has become. It's not the same as what it was last year. They're relying on, you know, a very different strategy, very different players to be able to carry them across the finish line, because I just don't think they have the same personnel that they did in certain positions last year, but it is kind of working out in its current state. We'll talk about how well Nuke is playing at the current moment, but for K-Corp, this is not encouraging. It is not encouraging to see them, okay, you lose to Fnatic, like, you can live with that. Fnatic looks awesome. They look like the best team in the entire league. You can survive in that front. Losing to BDS, especially in the way that you did, it's concerning, and there are reasons, I think, to still be fine and optimistic about K-Corp moving forward. This is still a best of 1 after all, but there are real traits here that I don't think are particularly great for KC to have, and we'll see if they end up sticking with those. We'll start with BDS, though. Player of the game is once again going to go to Nuke. This guy has gotten so many of these over the course of this split because he really is kind of the carry for BDS. He has very quietly been like a superstar level player here for BDS so far this split. I saw someone be like, oh, Nuke might actually be a top 3 mid laner in terms of production this split. I think he's been better than that. Like, I think he's been top 2, maybe top 1. Like, in terms of the actual production that he's putting out, it's like genuinely insane what he's been able to do, and he is the #1 option right now for BDS. This is not really a role that he had in 2024. It's not really a role that he's had at any point in his career. He had that breakout in 2023 where he really, like, established that he should be starting in the LEC and starting in the top level in Europe, and 2024 to me was the best best year of his career. He really stabilized, was a big positive in the regular season, got better as the year went on, and that progress has carried over into 2025. Somehow the growth is still going for Nuke, and if he's going to be like a #1 option for BDS, that does raise the floor and the ceiling, I guess, of what this team could accomplish. The Aurora looked really excellent here, but it wasn't just him. 113 with another really great game for BDS, this time against his former organization in Corp. Really great to see that he is really finding his footing. Again, we talked about it earlier this week. 113 and Paris both really starting to kind of understand, I think, what they're supposed to be doing at the LEC level and how they fit in particular into this team and the configuration of these players. I think playing around Nuke has definitely eased the process up, not playing for late game nearly as much around like an ice, like hyper carry, like a Jinx or something like that, I think definitely has helped a lot of things, but 113's early games have just gotten better. He just feels a lot more confident. This is not a strawless 113 anymore like it kind of was in week 1. This definitely feels a lot closer to what I anticipated 113 was going to be for this team, which is a top half jungler. He has definitely been that over the past like back half of the regular season. Ice and Paris were fine. Paris in particular, really aggressive. Really happy to see that. Ice, I think, has fit his role of secondary carry really nicely here. I always thought he would be really good in that role. He didn't really get the chance to do that for BDS last year because he was the #1 option for them, but moving to a different style of game, I think, allows Ice to just be a little bit more open-ended in terms of how he plays, and he's done that well, and Irrelevant was much better here. Kana, not exactly the best end to the regular season. We'll talk about that, but BDS just generally really good across the board. Nuke in particular, though, looks like a star, like looks like an MVP finalist here for me, and, you know, spoiler alert, we'll talk about some of my awards at the end of this video. Nuke's looking great. Then for Corp on the other side, not so great. Like, certainly can't be quite as optimistic about what they showed here. I do think there are still positives to take away from this in the sense that, like, I think Kana could have been worse, and, like, Kalist, I think, is, like, trying to do things on things like Kaisa, and generally, I don't think this was, like, a hands diff. This was a draft diff, at least in my opinion. Again, a lot of these teams going towards these early game poke-oriented comps and just not really having that payoff in week 3. You know, Jace, Nidalee, Kaisa kind of fits into that as well. Just not really having a ton of outs once you start to not have a ton of pressure early. You know, it just isn't a draft that I would see a lot of teams consistently go towards in best of 3s, and I certainly think this would be the kind of draft that you move away from in a game 2 if it were to exist. And so again, I'm not going to panic too much, but there are real concerning qualities. Yike, just losing early and looking awful and not being relevant on the Nidalee. It's not a good look. Like, he has to be better than this. He honestly wasn't nearly as good in the second half of the regular season as he was in the first half. Week #1 was phenomenal from Yike, and he didn't carry that same level of aggression and success, I would say, over to the second half of the regular season. I think Vladi just got outplayed here. Nuke has been really, really great. I don't think Vladi should be criticized too heavily for that, but Nuke really has been excellent. That's just another feather in his cap. He's been better than Vladi this split. Targamas is starting to feel like Targamas again, where he's being super aggressive without really a lot of setup. He's kind of skipping steps on the process. I think if Yike and Kana aren't going to do the setup for him, he could still fall into a lot of the tendencies that he fell into last year that caused him to really struggle, which is just kind of going for plays without properly putting the effort in to make sure those plays are doable in the first place. You know, Kalist wasn't the problem. Kana wasn't as good as Irrelevant, but there's only so much you can do on the Jace in this game. Like, Corp has issues here, and they're definitely at least a bit concerning, but hopefully they're going to be able to figure these things out. You would hope that they'd be able to bounce back in a game 2 or a game 3 against a team like BDS, but in a best of 1, you don't have that opportunity. If you screw up draft, you screw up the series. So, loss for KC and a win for BDS. I don't really know what this BDS floor or ceiling looks like. This is a team that I've hovered around 5 or 6 basically for a while now. Are they as good as a GIANTX? You know, maybe. Like, I think that's realistic. Are they better than a Vitality? Yeah, I think that that's pretty realistic as well. But what is the ceiling? Could this team get top 3 or top 4? I don't really know. Like, I don't know if they have that in them. If Nuke is going to play like this, I think anything's possible. 1-1-3 and Paris do seem like they're coming along, and it does feel like this team is getting better, and that's always a good sign, but I still am a little bit 1 foot in, 1 foot out on BDS's upside for the rest of winter. Then moving on to game 4 here of week #3, and you know, expected outcome, but certainly a team figuring its identity out. G2 Esports taking on Team Heretics, and G2 is going to pick up the victory. They are going to move to 6-3, and they're 4-0 in their last 4 games. That's a pretty encouraging trend, and while I don't think all 4 of those games have looked incredible, I think the most encouraging part is that the last 2 were the best of those wins, and You always want to be peaking down the stretch. You always want that momentum. You always want to be getting better throughout the split. That's why I was so high on BDS just a second ago, because it does feel like they are like moving in the right direction. And G2 is kind of the kings of that right now, and they've been the kings of that for a very long time. This is a team that almost always struggles at some point throughout the year and ends up coming through, ends up winning the title, and just ends up dominating the region once again. I think there is a lot of reasons to believe that this roster could do that, and they could be that. And I think they're on pace to kind of be that. For Heretics, they are a fun, young, intriguing team with a very good AD carry, a really solid bot lane, a jungler who can exist against good teams and bad solo laners at the current moment. I like what Heretics is. I don't think they're good. I don't think this is a team that's going to be competing to actually achieve results in 2025, but at the very least, they are showing signs of life, which I think is more than maybe I anticipated from them at the beginning of the year. Player of the game pretty much has to go to Broken Blade. What a gigantic Cho'Gath this was. Broken Blade is always at his best when he can get some beefy boy up on the top side to just be able to take over the game with, or at least that's kind of been the case for G2 Broken Blade over the past couple of years. Of course, Cho'Gath does fit into that. We've seen Cho a couple of times throughout this week already. Like, this isn't the first Cho'Gath game, but this is the first time I am going to, like, really mention him and really go into it, because it was the first time that Cho really had a major impact on the game. Broken Blade has been kind of neutral for G2 across this split so far. This is easily his best game of the split, and it happens at a perfect time right before the best of three. So, credit to Broken Blade. Excited to see that. I think Labrov continues to look really good. Skewmon continues to look really good. They're the two most important players. I know that Broken Blade, Caps, and Hansama can win at the domestic level and can win by a large margin. Even if I have questions about like what Hans is at an international level, like this guy has consistently gotten finals MVPs from me in the LEC because he is somebody that shows up domestically and can win playoff series. We know Caps and Broken Blade are going to be fine in those best of fives. It's really all going to be about the development of Skewmon and Labrov, and they've been really great down the stretch. When we talk about this team ramping up and these last two games in particular really being their two best, it's because both Skewmon and Labrov have looked so good in both of them. Labrov feels a lot more active in the early game, being able to punish a lot of missed positions in the mid game, and Skewmon is just generally following up on that well. I think those two have gotten a lot better chemistry throughout the split, and that's really helped both of them, I think, really evolve and emerge and start to get to the parts that we expected to see from them, you know, a lot quicker than they actually were there. Caps was excellent. Kamalu was putting up no resistance on the other side of this matchup, and Hans was good as well. Broken Blade definitely the standout player for G2, but definitely more of a team effort. And man, like if they play like this, they're going to win the split. Like we know that's a possibility for G2, and they're on their way to doing that. Then for Heretics on the other side, again, I want to reiterate, I don't hate this team by any means, but the solo laners are getting glazed a little bit too much. I think this team is also just getting glazed a little bit too much. The expectations were so low for Heretics by basically every analyst that everything I see about them is like, oh, they're showing a lot of promise. You know, they could be good by summer. They could be getting better. You know, Flakid's really good, and I think Stend is a solid player. Sheo is fine as a jungler at this level. Carlson and Kamalu are not good. Like, they are players that are going to require quite a bit of development in order for this team to even be relevant at all across this year. Like 8th, I think, is probably around their cap. At 3 and 6, I think that's a relatively good outcome. Kamalu is going to get dud of the game. He's gotten a lot of these. They've lost 6 games. He's gotten 4 dud of the games. When he loses incredibly hard. And this is kind of what we expected. I think the reason it's not getting talked about nearly as much as a lot of the other players who are underperforming in that same way or not performing well is because the expectation and the anticipation was in the toilet for Kamalu. People just were not expecting him to be good from day number 1, and he has not been good from day number 1. He has really been exactly, I think, what we all thought he was going to be, which is a player that really struggles to do things that aren't super comfortable for him. He's pretty one-dimensional, and when that dimension isn't there, he just isn't good, and that was the case on the Sylas. Carlson has also just kind of been a big nothing on the top side. He has not really had a lot of positive moments throughout this split. I'm concerned about the solo lanes. I get it's Broken Blade and Caps, but this is not like a new phenomenon for Heretics against G2. This isn't like a one-game assessment or analysis. This has been the case across all 9 of their games here in the regular season. That Sheo can do fine. He can win. Flakid's really good. He's genuinely a really good AD carry, and him and Stend have good chemistry. Stend, I think, is coming along nicely. He doesn't have the highest floor that, you know, I think he could possibly have. There are other supports that have come up that I think have been a little bit better from day 1, but he is still a solid enough player. It's just the solo laners don't really have that juice just yet. Maybe they grow into it, but it is certainly not there as of this moment. And then for G2, like I said, you know, I'm happy for this team. Congratulations to them. They're going to be at 6 and 3. They were 4 and 0 in their last asked for. This is where G2 should be. Skewmon and Labrov have really come along, and everybody else is predictably falling into line. This is still a team that's very much a favorite to win the LEC title here in winter, regardless of what happened earlier on in the split, and it does feel like they're getting closer and closer to that goal. But that's going to bring us to our final game of the regular season here in the winter split, and we saved the most predictable for last. It's SK Gaming taking on Fnatic, and Fnatic, of course, is going to be able to pick up the win, the dominating win here. Anybody who thought this was going to go any other direction was crazy, and honestly, I'd like to meet you. That would be an insane take to have, but congratulations to Fnatic. They end out the regular season at 8-1. They look about as good as you could possibly look, and it's everything. It's everybody clicking in every possible way. This team is looking genuinely phenomenal. For SK on the other side, this team is bad. Like, they're out now at 1-8. They're going to be going home alongside Rogue and, you know, trying to figure things out going into the spring split. I don't know if this team is going to make roster changes. Like, Rogue will make a change in the AD carry role. Like, they just will. It's going to happen. I don't know if that's going to happen with SK. I don't know if they just run it back, because the players that are underperforming, they were investments and they were, you know, promotions from lower leagues. You have to hope that they can get some of their bearings and get their feet under them and play at least a little bit better. There have been flashes from players like GIANTX, but, you know, someone like Loopy you brought over as an import, and so you kind of have to really stick to this and see if it works out. I don't know if it will, but, you know, this was a predictable way for their split to end. We'll just say that. For Fnatic, player of the game pretty much has to go to Mickey X. I think Razork played one of the best games that we have seen. We'll talk about him in a second because there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Razork, but Mickey X is just entirely ridiculous at the current moment. It's the odd year Mickey X formula. Honestly, I hate to say it, this has continuously been something to monitor, is that in even years he has been very flippy, very inconsistent, has not necessarily found the ability to play, you know, good game in and game out, to play well in a lot of those circumstances. But you get to these odd years, you get to 2023, and he's the best player in the league. 2021, he's one of the better players in the league. And now you look here at 2025, and he's back to being the best support in the LEC. It's crazy how this happens. The off-year, on-year, you know, thing for Mickey X is fantastic, and Fnatic ended up getting him on a good year, which is great, because this is not just a good year, it's a great year. This game is like top 1 support in all of the West type of caliber. I mean, he just completely ran the map. He genuinely won all 3 lanes by himself. Like, maybe not by himself, right? Like, Upset did a good job. Oscar Renin, I think, has been playing really well. Humanoid was fine in this game, but Mickey X was everywhere on the map, and he actively was creating for all 3 lanes. You just don't see support play like this in the West, especially. It's crazy to see what he was able to get away with, but you got to talk about Razork as well. It's not like he underperformed at all on the Zyra. This is the best player in the LEC at the current moment. Razork came into the year as, like, pretty clearly the #1 jungler. I think it would have been more up for debate if Jankos had been playing, because I just think very highly of Jankos as a player, but Razork, with the crop of junglers that was there, was the player that came in #1 for me. It's not a question of whether or not he's the #1 jungler. Right now, he might be the #1 European player in the world, and that's genuinely crazy to say, and Razork deserves a lot of that praise. He is, you know, a player that I think has really grown year in and year out. Like, the first couple of years with Fnatic, they were not particularly consistent. I talked about it a lot on this channel, where it felt like there was, for every 2 steps forward, there was 1 step back, and while he was getting better, it wasn't at the rate that you maybe wanted to see. Him and Humanoid felt like they had negative chemistry together as a duo, because Razork needed to win early, and Humanoid would often throw away early game leads for no reason. Like, it never really felt like it was going to click for him on Fnatic in the way that maybe they wanted it to. And that was really the case up until 2024, where, again, like I said, the consistency really started to come in. He had the best year of his career. Now it's getting even better. We are past the stage of, like, oh, is he, like, a top 2 jungler that can be consistent game in and game out, that can hide his weaknesses? No, like, he's the best player in Europe, and it's really, really fun to watch that progression happen, and for him to be the leader of this Fnatic team that is vying for a championship, that's vying for first place. Similar thing with Upset, who's come in here and been the best AD carry in Europe so far this year. I mean, genuinely incredible what he's been able to do. The aggression that he is showing is so fun to watch. I mean, he is genuinely going out there and playing the most aggressive AD carry that we have seen from anybody in the LEC, let alone from someone like Upset, who was kind of known for his passiveness the past couple of years. Obviously, being on a good team will do that, but just being encouraged to be that kind of player, I assume, by the organization, by players like Mickey X and Razork, who they themselves are very aggressive. It's very fun to see. Oscar Renin having the best split of his career. Humanoid's been stable, and again, a really good number, like 3 option on this team right now. Fnatic just feels like they're clicking in every single possible way. They are going into the playoffs as favorites, and we'll see if they can hold on to that, but For SK on the other side, again, not really much analysis that I can give that I haven't already given. Like, there are 3 players on this team that are not even remotely LEC caliber, and you can maybe make that 4 if you really want to talk about Isma in a more negative light. I think I'm a little bit higher on Isma than maybe, like, consensus is, because I do think his early games are fine, but GIANTX, Reeker, and Loopy are just not good. Like, they're not LEC caliber players in the way that they are currently operating. Loopy has been very quietly horrendous. He's done of the game here. I haven't heard anybody talking about how bad Loopy has been. It's all been like, oh, Reeker's the worst mid. Like, he has like historically low kill numbers through the first couple of games. And like, yes, that's absolutely true. Reeker has been awful. He's been arguably the worst mid laner in the entire league. You know, him and Larson, I think, are kind of duking that out right now. GIANTX has not been particularly good, especially outside of lane, where he's been easily the worst top laner in terms of team fighting and just playing 5v5s in general. But Loopy is not getting talked about as a player that's been like an albatross for this team. Going from Luan to Loopy, I think, is maybe the biggest downgrade we saw in almost any team across the entire world. I don't know what Rahel was thinking. Loopy is not an LEC caliber player. We kind of saw that coming. A lot of people told me, trust the process. Rahel and Loopy had good chemistry on DK Challengers. I was really critical of his tape, and you know what? It's been even worse than I could have ever predicted it. Like, this has turned from a top 2 bot lane into a bottom 3 bot lane purely because Loopy is just like unable to play at this level. It's not good. And it's not to say Reeker was better or GIANTX was even remotely playable in this game. Neither of those things were the case. Rahel continues to not really be able to do anything, and it's not really his fault. Isma, I still think, is the only one even attempting to do anything on this team, even if a lot of the plays he's going for are wrong plays. At least he's going for plays. Like, at least it's something for SK, but this team needs a major overhaul. Their winter split is done. They will be going home alongside Rogue, and they will be not participating in the best of 3 stage. We'll see what ends up happening for them for the rest of the year, but fantastic stuff for Fnatic. Nothing else really to say. All 5 members look incredible. They all look the best that they have, either in a long time or maybe ever for some of these players. Players like Razork and Oscar have never looked this good. Players like Mickey and Upset are kind of getting their form back, and it's just really cool to see. If they can keep up this macro and this mechanical difference, Fnatic is not only going to be a team that competes to win the LEC, but they're going to be a team that ends up competing against some of the better teams coming out of the East. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Winter Split Week number 3 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the final standings from the regular season in the LEC Winter Split. You can see every team that's made the top 8 underlined here, and obviously the 2 teams at the bottom will not be making the top 8, as we already kind of anticipated and already knew. We'll quickly go over this and just generally how these seeds ended up working out. I think the bracket is more important, which we will touch upon a lot more later on in this section. But for now, let's quickly go over my personal power rankings, which you can see to the right of every single team under the power rank column. Change is just going to be how those have changed from last week to this week. Not really a lot of movement, not really a lot of changes, even though there were some upsets this week, just because best of ones are really hard to quantify. And I am putting teams more in tiers right now than I am in specific spots, right? One of those tiers is top 2. I think the top 2 teams are very clear. The big 2 favorites into the playoffs are, established. I think Fnatic is going to stay at number 1 for me because they really have been that good, but G2 very much hot on their trail. They're going to go up from number 4 to number 2. Skewmon and Labrov seem to have integrated well, and if that's going to be the case, this is going to be a team that competes really, really quickly, I would say, for a title. Obviously, we'll talk about that more once we get to the bracket, but then we've got the next 2 teams that I think are kind of in a tier of their own, Corp and Movistar KOI, both of whom have shown really phenomenal flashes, but haven't necessarily ended the split great or haven't shown the consistency to lead me to believe that they're on the same level as like a Fnatic or a G2, and so Corp falls to 3, KOI falls to 4. I think they could win the league. I think it's theoretically possible for them to win the league. I just don't know if I'm expecting that. And then you've got a gigantic cluster in the middle of what I'd like to consider the next 3 teams. You have GIANTX at 5, BDS at 6, Vitality at 7. All of these teams are good enough to be able to make an impact, but I just don't know if they're going to be able to break into the top 4. I think mostly I'm grouping them together because you could put them in any order that you want. If you wanted Vitality at 5 and GIANTX at 7, because that's kind of the way things have been going as of late, I think that's fair. I leaned on the side of just not making any changes because I think all of them are very difficult to predict right now, and I think all of them are around the same skill level, and so whatever you want to do with those 3 teams, I think is relatively fair. All of them, again, have the potential to be able to cause some upsets, but aren't necessarily predicted for that. And then I think Heretics is kind of by themselves at number 8. I do have some movement at 9 and 10. SK is going to jump Rogue just because they beat them this week. Rogue just looks like a disaster. We'll see what happens if they get a new AD carry going into the spring split, but at least for now, they're the worst team in the league, and SK somehow, some way has jumped them into 9th place, which is just absolutely ridiculous. Both of them obviously done for the winter because the first 2 teams have been eliminated, but those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. Let's quickly get into my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 3 of the regular season to kind of wrap that up. Player of the week should not be a surprise. That is going to go to Razork, the jungler for Fnatic. This team is clicking on every single cylinder at the current moment, and Razork is the cog that is making everything move. He has been about as perfect as you could possibly ask for from a jungler in the LEC. He's super aggressive in the early game. He's been very consistent as a late game threat, as a great team fighter. He's not dying. He's like not giving over resources for free at all. He's not having to trade anything to get all of the advantages that he's getting. He's just in a great spot. He is the MVP of the league at the current moment. It's really fun to watch. My honorable mentions, runners up here for week 3, Nuke, the mid laner for BDS. Most weeks he would have gotten player of the week. He truly was exceptional for BDS, and he is kind of the lifeblood of that team at the current moment. I think he's like sneakily like the second best player in the league right now. He's been the best mid laner in the LEC in terms of production, in my opinion, across the winter split so far, and he would get my second place MVP vote if it was just a winter split vote. And then third place, my honorable mention, my third runner up is going to be Hylissang for this week. Not quite the MVP type of split that Nuke and Razork have had, in my opinion, but Hylissang was exceptionally good for Vitality, and he's super important towards this team's late success, like towards the back half of this split. Again, he kind of compares very favorably to how someone like Lehens is playing over in the LCK, where he's just playing so aggro and so greedy that if he's able to get all of the things he goes for, his team just like instantly wins the game. That's going to really work against a lot of the other middle of the pack teams, and that's what's kind of gotten him, you know, a lot of the success. He had a great week, and so my honorable mentions are Hylissang and Nuke, and my player of the week will be Razork. And then my dud of the week, it's going to stay the same as it was in week 2. It's going to stay as Patrick, the AD carry for Rogue. How could you possibly make it anything else? Patrick is the worst player in the LEC at the current moment. I doubt that he will have that starting job going into the spring split, or at least I would be surprised if that was the case, and you know, I feel bad because I love Patrick. I'm a big fan of his game. I was a real big proponent of him back in 2020, 2021, like the early era of Excel. I was really one that was pushing for Patrick being considered a top 1, top 2 AD carry in Europe, but he's just not that guy anymore. He has been the worst player in the LEC, the worst player that's ever graded out in the LEC, especially since the format changed into what it is now. You know, he's dud of the week. It really wasn't a difficult decision for me. And then, like I said, player of the week was Razork. Typically speaking, that would be the outro, but let's go ahead and quickly go over the actual playoff bracket. Of course, we start with best of 3s. We don't get to the best of 5s until it's only the final 4 teams remaining. And so we won't be talking that far into advance, but we are going to cover the first weekend of games and kind of give my predictions. The bracket has broken out very favorably, I think, for a couple of teams, and very interestingly for a couple of other teams. Fnatic and G2 being on the same side, I think, is very, very fun. That's definitely the main takeaway. But I'll quickly give my predictions here. Fnatic, of course, taking on Heretics. Fnatic should be able to pick up the win here. This should be the easiest matchup of round 1 for anybody. This should be a 2-0 sweep, and it shouldn't be particularly close. G2 taking on GIANTX. I really like this matchup. I think GIANTX has the potential to be able to, you know, make something interesting happen if Jackie's has a really good series, but, you know, G2's on fire right now. GIANTX is cold as ice, really, one of the colder teams coming into the best of 3 stage at all, and G2 should be able to pick up the win, which would lead to Fnatic versus G2 in a best of 3. Whoever ends up winning that is going to be the favorite to win the entire league. You can definitely count on that. Right now, it looks like that'd be Fnatic, and they won in the regular season in a best of 1, but anything can happen when Fnatic takes on G2. I'm super excited for that. And then on the bottom side of the bracket, we've got Movistar KOI taking on BDS. Right now, I would take Movistar KOI, but I don't feel like crazy about that. BDS is the kind of team that absolutely could take advantage of KOI's, you know, weakness in the later half of the game, their inconsistencies. If JoJo just has a bad series, or if him and Elyoya aren't on the same page, if Mirwin, you know, can just lose to Irrelevant on the top side, like there are many avenues for BDS to be able to win this, and there is a chance that in terms of current form, Nuke is the best player on the Rift in this series, and if that's the case, BDS could win a best of 3. Still gonna pick KOI because I do think they're the more well-rounded team. I think that most of their team is better, but again, if you get a couple of things to swing in the direction of BDS, I could absolutely see them taking this series. I think this is the closest matchup of round number 1. And then you've got Vitality taking on K-Corp. This one I feel less concerned about. K-Corp should be able to handle Vitality. In my opinion, this is one of those matchups that's like really interesting before you really think about how they match up against each other. I think Vitality's bot lane would really have to pop off, and you could theoretically see a matchup where Hylissang just kind of abuses Targamas in terms of, you know, what happens there, but I just don't really see a circumstance where the macro of K-Corp is going to fall apart to the explosive plays of Hylissang, and if that's not happening, I don't know if Vitality is going to be able to win a best of 3. You know, a player like Nako could potentially make a difference, but Kana might be the best top laner in the league at the current moment. And so I think K-Corp just matches up very favorably into Vitality across a large series. And so I'd pick K-Corp. And then let's say it's KOI versus K-Corp. That becomes interesting. I think K-Corp probably beats either KOI or BDS. And then, you know, they're in the top 3 guaranteed, which would obviously be fantastic for them. But let me know what you agree with or disagree with in terms of those takes down in the comment section below. Do you think the same as me right now? I guess if I had to go based off of my power rankings, it would be Fnatic and K-Corp, you know, kind of qualifying for that top 3 through the next weekend, and then, you know, G2 and KOI picking up victories, but not necessarily being able to move on. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments, and let me know what you thought of the video down in the comments as well. If you enjoyed, it really would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. It really helps out the channel a lot more than you know, and it lets me know you guys are enjoying the content as well. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the playoffs for the entirety of the LEC. We'll be covering everything across all 3 of the other major leagues as well. LTA video is going to be coming out tomorrow for week number 2, and then of course, we just did the LCK yesterday. LPL has returned, and, you know, we'll be covering that again very shortly on this channel across the next week or so. And First Stands right around the corner, the big first international tournament, the Winter International Tournament. So if you're interested in all that stuff, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all